Yes.
Hey, I'm Ella Feingold. I'm an orchestrator, and I'm with my orchestration partner most of the time, Jordan Cox. How you doing?
Good. How you doing?
I'm doing good. Do you want to quickly sort of name drop and just sort of say what it is that you do or who you've worked with?
I mean, well, I'd start off by saying actually what's funny is we have been working together probably, oh gosh, 7 years maybe.
Yeah,
That was actually really special to me because like we've sort of been best friends for a while. But the funny part is we've actually never really spent a lot of time in person together. So
never. Period. Yeah.
But like you were the first person I told we were having like my first kid to. Like we've just, we've been best friends for a long time. Um, our love of music sort of started that through a mutual friend, actually.
Ah,
Thank God connected us at some point, But we just, I would say we just have, a great relationship in terms of friendship, but also just in music. We'll just, you know,
yeah,
we talk for hours on the phone all the time.
and we do.
When either of us are driving, it's like,
Yeah, for those out there that are, listening, yeah, Jordan and I have orchestrated a lot of music together over the years. Ariana Grande, some Gary Scheinman games, Metamorphosis, um,
Wednesday.
Bungie, Destiny 2 for 7 years now, 6 years.
Yeah, Bungie being our biggest, but tons of Netflix shows, feature films. Like we've done a lot of stuff together. So
Yeah. And you know all of my idiosyncrasies and shortcomings and all of, when you jump in the score, you know all the things I'm going to probably do. And
oh no, and you know mine, and I, we were talking on the phone the other day. Like we sort of, I think we complement each other really well because, I had a background like you, so to speak. Like I went through a conservatory. Now being in Hollywood for so long, we do things slightly differently, and so there's a lot of deadlines and pressure and a lot of speed that needs to happen. So what's nice working with you is that a lot of times you'll just be like, slow down. Like let's look at how we can make this better. Whereas in Hollywood we don't always get a lot of time like that. So I think
yeah, that's true.
our styles and our personality and the way we orchestrate really complements each other. And because of that, we've just had a lot of success working together.
Yeah. And for those that are listening that don't know, you might be thinking, why do you need an orchestration partner? Do you not know how to orchestrate? And the answer is just deadlines. This is not concert music. This is, where you might have months to sit there and orchestrate and go for a walk in nature and come back and go, oh, it was the oboe all along. Yeah, we've got insane deadlines and things have to get out the door and get on stands. And so what that means is we all ask for help and work with people that we, trust. And so, yeah, that's why Jordan and I work together so we can make deadlines, you know.
There's even, the team even goes beyond that too, really. I mean, it's the the idea that like even I don't know if the word help is even right. It's sort of like a partnership. I don't know many people who do what we do in like a soloistic way. I
Yeah.
really don't. Even going back to the composer themselves, I don't think that a lot of composers are able to write all of the music really by themselves anymore. Uh,
Yeah.
Maybe that was true 10, 15 years and earlier when the deadlines weren't as crunched, but because streaming has changed everything for us. I mean, budgets are smaller. Anyone who's worked in Hollywood will tell you that. That's the first thing. Budgets are smaller, and it seems like time is crunchier. We now have like a week to work on an episode when we had maybe 2 weeks, or sometimes it's probably even 3 or 4 days, depending on, what the TV show is, or, if it's episodic like that. And so, you know, I know there are composers who do write everything, but realistically, I think if you're working on one or more projects, it's best to have a team. And so, the composer themselves, might have additional writers, or if they don't, they definitely have assistants who are dealing with the what I don't know if Bruce Broughton always says this, or who came up with it first, was like actually like 10% of what a composer does is actually writing, and like 90% is sort of admin and meetings and stuff like that. And so I think assistants come in handy for, you know, bouncing stems, doing all those extra things that take time, you know. Uh,
Yeah.
so it kind of starts there in sort of your team, sort of Christmas trees down to a whole to the orchestra and everybody that, you know, when the day the recording session happens, there's hundreds of people. Um, my students know that I say this often, probably too often, is, you know, when you look at the credits of a film, that's probably half the people who actually work on a film. You know, not
Mhm.
just in the music department. I think that's pretty true of everything because, you know, people's names fall through the cracks. There are hundreds more probably additional animators that come in, or I often think of even like the food services, like craft services, like there's probably tons of people who never get mentioned who do a lot of work for this. Um, and that's just like the music team too, actually. It's, you know, if you ever notice in the credits, I don't, I can't remember the last film I ever saw this on, but I'm sure it exists where the orchestra actually gets credited. You know,
Mhm.
soloists do. Every now and then you'll see a soloist name, but it's very rare to see, you know, all 100 people listed. And especially in, you know, London and LA where we may not use the same people every day. And that's just because they have other gigs that they go to. So, you know, on Monday you might have 30 violins for 30 violinists, and then on Tuesday the 30 violinists again, but maybe 15 of them are different people. So sometimes the names, you could have 200 different names, not necessarily that the orchestra was 200 people. It's just that that's how many people may have been on that project. So that's a huge part of why when people say, well, how could a movie cost this much? I always laugh. That's, you know, especially some of my family who they don't necessarily understand quite what orchestrators do. Not many people do actually,
A
but
lot of musicians don't. Yeah.
yeah, no, for sure. And you know, they'll say, "Well, how could a movie cost that much money?" I'm always like, "Oh, I could tell you how, you know, just looking at the music budget alone is there's many people involved. It takes a team. It really does. It takes a
Yeah.
Richard Bellis sort of instilled that in me when I did the ASCAP workshop many years ago. It was just like, you know, formulate your team. And I always thought, yeah, I really should. And now over the past, I guess, decade or decade and a half, however long it's been, I've learned that I work better when I'm working with people because they not only challenge me, but they also just help take the load off of it. You know, I want to have a personal life. Heaven
Yep.
for, you know, I've got kids, I've got a wife, I'm renovating my kitchen right now. Like I want to have some time to do my own things. And so having like you be able to help orchestrate, you know, whether we split a cue or I'll take the even cues, you take the odd cue, or whatever we decide, it's
Sure.
super helpful because it just allows us to one move faster as the deadline needs, but two, it also just means that I can not feel like I have to now spend a whole week, you know, 24/7 working on a project. So I can put my kids to bed or make them a meal or something like that.
And as you know, some of those cues we orchestrate, are
Uh,
just just so long, and some can just be so punishing that your eyes just glaze over, with the amount of notes. And yeah, so I thought that we could kind of just make a little video here, talking about starting from the composer and what would be optimal for the composer to give us as orchestrators,
mm,
or give the music prep team, what we as orchestrators would hope to receive, as far as like how it's structured and what kind of um, feedback that we're hoping to get from the composer, so that we can, understand their needs, and then maybe just sort of go down the line of, delivery, MIDI prep, whether that's transcribing, or not, whatnot, orchestrating, proofreading, making parts,
mm,
printing, taping, what's a librarian,
yeah.
and anything else, you want. So I guess I would say, as orchestrators, I think I mentioned this in another video, that we get a MIDI file from the composer. And I guess I'll just start with some things that for us would just be niceties, for people, for deliveries. So when we get a MIDI file, it would be nice if it reflected the score order, where the woodwinds were at the top, and the brass is in the middle and the strings are at the bottom. To save time, if you're writing with a string ensemble patch, and then you're divvying it out to individual patches, to sometimes, if you're confident that there's no differences in between the ensemble patch and what you split out, to get rid of certain duplicates, because whoever is preparing the MIDI is going track by track. And so if you liked your string patch and you copied it onto 5 more, but one of them has a couple of notes a little bit different, somebody has to go through left to right and do all that. So I'd say score order. I'd say for me, when I orchestrate, I like to have some things that we might not be orchestrating. Like sometimes, depending on who the composer is, like if there's not a lot of harmony, at least in what they wrote, sometimes, I don't know if you agree, but like the omnisphere or the synth patch might contain harmony that's only in the synths, that's not anywhere else. So it gives us a global sense of, we can see what we're hearing. I like to have some drums sometimes, timpani sometimes, because it confirms the bass line. I think sometimes we get stuff and there's like some questionable bass motion, and sometimes seeing the timpani confirms like, oh yes, you meant this note, even though again, we're not orchestrating this, or but yeah, it can help just give a more of a global sense. And then I guess for me, I would say having, if this is a new composer that you haven't worked for, having a conversation about what their expectations are of you. Are they looking for you to refine things and stop there? Are they looking for additional arranging, where they're, like, hey, I need you to fill this thing out, or, and just understanding what it is. Because as like sometimes we work for people and all of these, nuances and touches are so welcomed and so appreciated. And for other people, those are the things that get you fired, and so knowing what it is, what's being expected of you. And I think orchestration in 2021 is such a broad sense now. I know Conrad Pope likes to say orchestration is anything you say yes to. And, and I mean, what is it? Like sometimes we are getting something that's really well written, and it's just sort of getting it into the page and phrasing things and dynamics, and not a lot, almost more editing, and sometimes it is like, whoa, this thing is like, it needs a lot of help before, it gets to the players. And I think that, every composer has different needs and different expectations with the orchestrator. So I think that's an important thing. And if we're not getting picture, whether it's, concert music that we're orchestrating, or video game stuff, or film, whatever, to, if there's time, because obviously composers are insanely busy, but I think if there is time, it would go a long way with maybe just dropping some notes like, yeah, this should be icy here, this should be more menacing here. And being honest with the orchestrator, like, you know what, I didn't have time to really kill it with the mock-up, and I'm expecting this to be a little more menacing than it's delivered. And I think, to maybe go on a tangent a little bit, when you think about, you're a cellist, and when you think about music and how you phrase things, there are so many things that go into playing something, a phrase, a melody, where you're naturally crescendoing and diminuendoing and leaning into a note beyond what's on the actual page. And, let's be honest that sometimes as composers that you are using a legato horn patch, but, maybe there's more that needs to happen, with loading additional articulations, with having a tenuto on a note, or how you're getting off and writing in CC automation. and all that. So I think I know composers, and I don't want this to be an orchestrator rant, but I know that composers love to say it's in the mock-up and just listen, but music naturally has a lot of nuance with phrasing, with articulation, with dynamics. And if that needs to be literal in the page, then that also needs to be phrased with CC, data, and sometimes choosing the right patches or mixing articulations. So that's, I guess, sort of my hopes, when I'm receiving a sketch. Just some things. I know some orchestrators even go as far as asking composers to, mark up a score with dynamics or articulations, which I've never worked for anyone that would, do that. But, you and I have worked for composers that can be incredibly specific with how they need to get off of a note with edits and things like that. And, that we have sometimes sent a sketch and, said, do these ending durations look right to you,
Yeah. And I think kind of tailing off of that, like you're saying, like the descriptives are really helpful. Especially since we work a lot in video games, especially, we work a lot with Bungie and Gary Scheinman, two huge video game guys.
Yeah.
You got to remember for video games, even the composers don't actually get to see a lot of footage. So we often have a conversation. I know that we have a lot with Gary Scheinman, especially. What is happening in this scene? And he will sometimes either write an email or he'll get on the phone with us and explain, like, here's what's happening, here's what we're going for, kind of thing. Because it's not when you're working on a film that's linear, you can kind of figure out, especially if 1M1 to 6M1, you kind of know where things are going. If it's it's a horror thriller film, or if it's an action adventure kind of film, you get the idea through the scope of that because it's left to right. But in video games, it's not, and so we often welcome a lot of the descriptives that can come with, like, hey, this needs to be really somber here, and it helps us maybe make a different decision for orchestration, even
Absolutely.
dynamics, really, because like you said, something that's really helpful is if the composers are really specific about note lengths or attacks and things like that. I often will ask the composers, and I have to be careful about this. Everyone watching, like, I have to be careful. Like, I sometimes ask the composers to actually quantize the MIDI, because then I know that, oh, on the, everybody is off on the end of four, or that, with interesting syncopations and triplet rhythms and things like that. If it's not played in very accurately, or if it's sloppy, and the composers are really specific about how things look on the page,
Mhm.
it's not a bad idea to ask them to quantize it. We do
Can you,
have a person that does that for us.
right.
But if the composer, there are, and to use an example, I know that there have been a couple films where there was a cue that, oh man, I can't remember what the film was, but our MIDI cleanup guy wasn't quite sure of the rhythm, and what it was sort of like it had been a triplet with inside of a triplet, like a super triplet, basically, and it wasn't played in that way. And so we were having sort of these issues trying to figure out what the intention was, because it was so ahead or behind the beat depending on where it was. And so I remember when we actually asked the composer to quantize, well, can you just look at this cue, can you just quantize that for us? And when he did, it made way more sense. Like, even Sibelius understood what it was on a clean open, and so that
Can
was actually helpful.
Can you just quickly explain to anyone who's watching why we don't want things quantized sometimes, why we prefer it unquantized, and so the person who's cleaning,
Right. I think that there's a couple reasons that we'd want it unquantized. One, I actually personally like to have an unclean MIDI file, so that when I'm orchestrating, I can see exactly what the composer did. Because a lot of times what composers will do, and this is why I said you have to be careful on the quantizing, is that they'll play it in, and then they will, export that audio and then quantize. So sometimes the audio isn't always reflecting what exactly is happening in the MIDI itself. And sometimes composers will quantize, let's say a piece is in triplets and they accidentally quantize it to eighths. That has happened before, by the way. And so you're looking at something going, this is not it at all. And then it unfortunately just adds time to our timeline to have to have those conversations go back and forth. I also feel that we, as established orchestrators, you and I, we have people who are extremely good at cleaning MIDI and really anticipating sort of the composer's intention with things, so that when we get our sort of sketch, which is basically the composer sends us a MIDI file and an MP3 or a WAV file, and when we have people who clean the MIDI for us and import it into our template, and then we're looking at it in terms of this is pretty accurate from what we understand that our assistant sort of cleaned for us. But then I still like to look at the unclean MIDI file as now a third set of eyes, so to speak. If the composer is the first set and then our MIDI cleaners are the first, then our second, then we are the third. To look at it and also go, okay, this is exactly what we're looking at. This is what we're hearing, and we might adjust things. And I know that you and I will have long conversations about that as well, where, it was cleaned this way, but it kind of feels more, this is probably more specific to note endings. And again, this is also really important in video games. Why we're talking about this is, especially with video games that have to be edited, releases and attacks are so important. It's maybe less important in film and TV. I'm not saying it's not important, but it's probably less important because there's not this whole gameplay thing happening. So, because we have crunchy deadlines and we often have hours of music to orchestrate and record in very short amount of times, we try to spend as little time as possible talking about the technical thing and just getting it right the first time. But we have had conversations where we look at something and we're not sure. Is it on the and of four? Is it going to beat one? Like, it's really hard to know
Yeah,
sometimes.
and we're talking about things where maybe there's a brass swell, and is it if we're in 4/4, just talking about one measure, is it a half note going up? Are we tying it to an eighth note? Are we tying it to a 16th note? Is it tied to an eighth note with a staccato dot? I think you and I typically will tie to an eighth note, just to make sure they make it all the way through and they get off in a certain place. When we're diminuendoing, is it a whole note with a hairpin to N? Is it a dotted half note tied to an eighth note where we can sort of hear a little bit of a lift off of the sound? Is it a whole note tied to an eighth note to the next bar with niente? So even though they don't literally make it to the next bar, it's just making sure that they don't end early. There's so many different ways that we think about notation, because notation is psychological, and sometimes tying two durations gives the composer a clean edit, and sometimes we do things because psychologically it makes sure that they don't end a little bit early because they're scared they're going to go into the next bar, sort of, or it's just a, kind of like from choral notation where you're enunciating like world, like how you're getting off of something. And that's something we think about. But I just wanted to say, for those that don't know, that when we get a file, it goes to someone on our team or a music prep team that is, preparing it, which means quantizing it. I know sometimes we have people that we work with that, will do extra things that not everyone will do, but, putting a little more in the page. Sometimes they put in, articulations. Sometimes they decide on enharmonics. Should this be in flats or sharps? But I just want to say, without throwing a number out there, for those that don't know, is that that's a service that costs money. That's accounted for in the budget. Whether the orchestrator absorbs that cost or not, that when you're paying someone to orchestrate music, that on the front end, there is a job of someone to go through the MIDI file from the composer and prepare it for the orchestrator. And so that is someone's job. We're talking about the job now, but just that is something that is paid for, so I just wanted to make that clear.
And then as they're giving us files, then it goes to the orchestrator.
Yeah.
in this case us who spend the time orchestrating this. And then the orchestration process, like you said, it can depend how long that takes. It depends on the queue, the length of the queue. We always joke animation is probably the hardest, and especially as me, I'm also an animation composer. Like, not only are there more cues, there's the cues are shorter and there are a lot more of them. But two, I feel like orchestrating that stuff is it requires a little more nuance because often in animation we actually utilize the woodwinds in sort of their rightful color. So it's this extra step, and a lot of animated films will want live percussion. That's something that that I don't think a lot of people are aware of, is that we don't utilize, in my opinion, we don't utilize enough real percussion.
Sure.
I love real percussion. There's nothing more exciting than having percussion in the room with you, by the way, and it just doesn't happen anymore. Um, and it's even, I feel like, more rare to find real percussion. It seems like everybody wants to record strings and brass and they'll use sample percussion and no woodwinds. So, depending on what the gig is, it can be, oh, we're just doing strings for this show and then we're done. And the cues are maybe, a minute long, or, 40 bars, 50 bars. And then you can get something into animation where they want to record mallet percussion, unpitched percussion, timpani, all that stuff, as well as harp, piano, celeste, and of course you got your strings and your choir and all that extra things that it just depends. And of course, bigger epic films too, such as Star Wars or Avengers and those kinds of things, they'll have those as well. It all just depends. This is why I think, like, my favorite thing is, some of my students will say, oh, I saw such and such movie and I saw that there was only one orchestrator. And I always kind of laugh because I'm thinking there were probably 6 or 7 other orchestrators who just didn't get credited. And on top of that, what's happening more and more now too, and especially with some of my colleagues that I orchestrate with, is that we even have to have like assistant orchestrators who have to help. Like we said, the deadlines are just so tight now. I think it's almost impossible to think that one person could actually orchestrate a feature film of 90 to over 200 minutes of music. I think that would be impossible for one person to orchestrate, just given sort of the deadline. So it wouldn't be uncommon for you to watch the credits and see one or two people's names, but also to have to keep in mind that there are probably 6 to 10 other individuals who helped out, whether they did one or two cues or 50% of the orchestration. And as you mentioned, then there are also the people who clean the MIDI who maybe didn't get credited because we don't often credit that as orchestration. It might be MIDI preparation. It just depends on how that team works. Like you said, sometimes the people we work with, they do more. So we might credit them as music preparation or MIDI preparation or additional orchestration. I know that James, who works with me quite a bit, like him and I, because of sort of what he does for me, it really is more like additional orchestration, so to speak, because he will not only clean the MIDI, but he's kind of doing like a sort of first pass of orchestration with me, and then also proofing my stuff too, and making changes based on that, just depending on what project we're working on. So you have, even just within sort of the orchestration realm, all these different people who are involved. And like I said, the movie credit's probably only going to credit several of those, and an orchestration budget is based on a page rate. If it's a union film, we might say, we used to charge sort of, or we still do, 4 bars per page, was sort of the page rate. And that's how orchestrators get paid. As things have sort of developed, I find now orchestrators either charge by minute, or they'll still charge a page rate, but they kind of have to figure out a page rate based on different tempi that might be in the film. The other thing to note too is that we've gotten hopefully smarter in the terms of, we don't actually just put 4 bars per page anymore. Like we still charge as 4 bars, but being more paper conscious, I think we try to do either, we kind of try to do as much of phrasing as possible, I think, right? I think on some things you and I might like say we're going to phrase the page, or we'll format the page by the phrase, just depending on what what it is. If there's a lot of 16 30-second notes, you're only going to get 4 bars per page. But
Yeah, I think we're around 6 bars a page, and when it's just footballs, yeah, that can be whatever. Can be
right,
12 bars sometimes.
yeah.
I know some orchestrators, will never put more than 10 bars on a page, but
Yeah, I'm a little bit more paper conscious, I think.
yeah,
I feel like we waste so much paper. So
yeah,
I try to, put it as much that's visually pleasing on the page if we can. And I know other orchestrator colleagues of mine do the same. They're very, and some orchestrators even hide the empty staves. So you're always looking at a system of whoever's playing. You and I don't do that. I know for our stuff, we tend to have everybody playing. Of course, most of the stuff we work on, everybody's playing all the time anyway. So we didn't
I
really.
was just gonna say, yeah, yeah, you're talking about, hiding staves like study scores,
Yes.
so that each page is showing really, what whoever's playing at that moment. But yes, you're right that a lot of the stuff we're working on, some clients sort of just want this big gray mass, and that is sort of everyone kind of blowing their brains out. But especially with video game music, and I talked about this in a video before, that we might get music that sort of looks like, wait a minute, is this a 5 minute tootie that's happening? Like everyone's playing, but what we don't know as orchestrators is how that gets built into a Lego kit, where just because everyone's playing for 5 minutes doesn't mean that's what's happening in the game. Sometimes that different things are turned on and off with intensity,
Yeah.
with brass and whatever. Sometimes they use the brass alone in the game, even though we've orchestrated and recorded strings, at the same time. So yeah, I thought maybe we can move on, because you and I could talk for hours about what do we do as orchestrators. And I mean, we should, talk about that at some point, but I thought this video could be kind of just
Mhm.
describing the jobs and a little bit of, what goes into it. So maybe the next thing is, after we're done orchestrating that, the next phase is, if the composer doesn't need to see the score, proofreading,
Mhm.
and that if there's budget, that, sometimes we're hiring proofreaders and they are also charging an hourly rate. Sometimes it's the same person on the team that prepared the MIDI, because they have a sense of what the cue was, because they, prepared the MIDI. I know for me, and I'm sure for you, I proofread everything and then have someone proofread it.
And we
Uh,
can proof each other's stuff too,
yeah, and we proof each other's
and
stuff too.
still
Yeah,
send it to a proofreader typically.
yeah.
Whether
And there's different proofreading. There's proofreading as an orchestrator, like I'm proofing my score. And again, we could make a video just on proofreading and what are the things that we look for. But as orchestrators, we're looking for certain things to cover our tracks and make sure that, we haven't forgotten anything. We're doing certain niceties for the conductor, of course, with phrasing the pages so there aren't awkward page turns for them, choral divide arrows, obviously doing some things for the players with courtesy accidentals and confirming, things, because we don't use keys, we don't use key signatures. And then there's also proofreaders who are proofreading the parts that you're making. So maybe we could just talk about, the next phase after
right,
proofreading, like what happens once, as orchestrators, we send our proofed scores.
right. So what really happens is we send our scores to a proofreader, and then we get them back and we make any changes we need to, and then we would export as a PDF. And then I like to export a PDF and then make a copy of that Sibelius file, because we work in Sibelius or Dork or whatever we're working in. And then I send that to the copyist. So not only do I have a copy of the original PDF that I exported, but I also have my original score Sibelius file, just in case. But I send a Sibelius file and a score PDF to the copyist. And from then, and again, this is where, and especially in a big budget film, there could be tons of copyists. I mean, copying is a really, I think it's one of like, I feel like it's one of the most overlooked things in terms of like, oh, it's just sort of like somebody making parts. But, it is making parts, but then you're also looking at each part, making sure it makes sense and harmonically. And especially like in film scoring where we're modulating constantly, and harmonics can look really screwy in a part. In a score, we kind of go back and forth depending on how, I know I'm kind of backtracking, but this is kind of important for copying. We often like I guess depending on the client, but we like to show our scores more so vertically, top to bottom. Is it an A flat major chord? Everybody's playing an A flat major chord, A flat, E flat, C natural, whatever. And if the next chord happens to be C sharp minor, that's just we're displaying it that as that. I know you could say it could be D flat minor, but it's sort of it just depends on how we want to show the chord in the score. What that does though in the parts is it sometimes makes it quite awkward, especially in film scoring where we overuse chromatic medians quite a bit, where I think it actually affects more so the second player in a chord. Like if it's a three note chord in the trombones, the second trombone player might be going from F sharp to G flat, F sharp to G flat, while it's the same note. So, a copyist is checking for all of that kind of stuff. And I know it probably doesn't sound as intense, but what it actually not only has to happen is we have to make sure that our page turns work correctly. We have to make sure that we're actually formatting our parts to look good. But then going through and making sure that this makes sense and harmonically, because you have to think like a musician. I think a copyist has to be, has to pretend to put on the French horn player's hat and sit down and go, okay, how does this have to look? Because like I said, we modulate so often in film music that the enharmonics can look quite awkward, and sometimes you just can't avoid awkward enharmonics or awkward leaps. It's part of the job. But I think that the copyist has to really sit down and say, can I read this left to right? Does this make sense? Is something too crammed? And I find still that the copyists are also doing an additional layer of proofing, because I know that the guy who copies for me will often email me a whole errata of like, I caught this, and I'm like, oh man, this went through how many rounds of proofing, and some missed it, and
Yeah.
when I as a copyist as well, if I am working on a big film, I do catch things too as well that I'm like, oh, that's weird. Everybody's playing a G minor chord, but French horn
Even
is playing an A flat. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, even in orchestration for me, like I'm proofreading top to bottom, left to right. I'm focusing on staves. I'm going section by section in panorama. I go into the parts, and still, and me, I'm very, very like obsessive with my scores. And still, people catch things and there's errata. And, my good friend Matthew Maslanka has a saying, I never regretted having a second look at things, taking a second look. And there's just, even with plugins with Sibelius and all of this stuff, you still, there's always errata, there's always little small things. And of course, these are things that aren't going to bring a session to its knees,
No,
but
but it's
we like to have good hygiene with, checking things and dotting our I's and crossing our T's.
yeah. The thing too to understand is that these recording sessions cost thousands of dollars. I mean, I've been on recording sessions where we've actually taken the budget and divided it by the session, like by the session minute, and we were kind of figuring out that each minute was costing like almost $2,000. When you actually contemplate, like when you actually think about the orchestration, the mixing, the copying, the printing, and then the players and the scoring stage,
Yeah.
like it's costing that much money. So for the second oboe player to raise their hand and go, I have a question. Why do I have blah 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 blah? And it's like, if that's something that could have been avoided by the copyist just making the B flat and A sharp, or what, you know what I'm saying? I'm just using an example, or
Yeah.
just like proofing something extra. We just saved $2,000. But
And that's why, as orchestrators, why we might be redundant with dynamics, like restating dynamics every 2 bars, that are tacit. Why, I know you dial me back, but just with, piano, crescendo, mezzo forte, diminuendo, piano, crescendo, mezzo forte, sometimes sim is enough, but sometimes we break, we come back, there's a page turn, and yeah, what dynamic are we at?
and keep in
And
mind that players are people. They make mistakes and not even that, I shouldn't have said that first. Like, players are people that have to record a lot of music in a lot of time, and they are sight reading. They
Yep.
probably came from a 2 hour rehearsal prior, and then they maybe taught after that, and then now they're sitting down to play a session. Like, it's a courtesy to them, and I love my musician friends so much that I find it's just a keystroke for me to copy paste that, so that the poor violinist who's going to be crescendoing and diminuendoing for 90 bars doesn't forget halfway through when they're trying to think of, did my husband pick up my daughter from daycare, did I order groceries, all these extra things that come to mind. It's like, it just makes their job easier so that they don't mess up, and then we don't have to worry about getting another take. It's
Right.
all about
And
being efficient.
yeah, I mean, we're in the recording business and we're in the sight reading business. And I know maybe for concert composers looking at Hollywood film scores or video game scores that it might seem like it's patronizing to the player to be so literal, like they're musicians, of course they're going to do this and do that. And there is a fine line of not doing so much in the page that's absolutely obnoxious to the player, but enough so like you're saying that, if we take a break and come back, like the trumpet player doesn't have to raise their hand and say, hey, am I still in a harmon mute?
Yeah.
Especially with brass. That's why we reiterate mutes and have courtesy reminders with a lot of things. Because like you said, as soon as somebody raises their hand, there's dollar signs just going. And so as orchestrators and as copyists and proofreaders, whatever we can do to confirm a tonality, a technique, and is it's
Um,
can't hurt, might help.
Yeah, I like that phrase. One of Belinda Broughton, who's just one of the greatest violinists out there, someone who's really close to me and kind of mentored me a lot, I feel like, when I came up. She often would tell me, like, no one's gonna complain about more detail. They might roll their eyes and be like, oh, okay.
Or ignore some of the things,
Yeah,
but
but I feel like more detail is never really going to hurt you as much as less detail. You know, Having writing non-divide and putting a bracket in is redundant. I get that. I'm a cellist. I would be like, of course, especially if I saw a quadruple stop, be like, of course, we're going to just do, I know that, but just seeing it non-divisi, seeing a bracket, yeah, I might roll my eyes, but I'm going to play it right versus not having any of that stuff. You don't know. You don't know. And again, we also have to remember that I work in Hollywood. I orchestrate for the Hollywood musicians. I know what they like and dislike. But if I have to orchestrate something that's going to a different place, I don't know how they're going to play. They're not my sort of usual people, I would say.
Mhm.
So we might take extra precautions depending on where we're going. And I know you and I have actually orchestrated film or concert music, that film stuff for concert music, and I felt like had to be we I felt like we even had to be more detailed because we thought these people are not going to understand the sort of language that we normally use. There's certain things that we just use that in Hollywood everybody goes, I know exactly what that means. I don't even have to think about it. And in a concert score, I would never put that. As a concert composer, I would never do that.
Yeah.
In fact, like you said, I would put less dynamics because they just know what to do. But again, our people are sight reading. So
Yeah.
piano crescendo to mezzo piano diminuendo for 100 bars in a row, it might look redundant. I understand that. But again, halfway through playing through it, I mean, I would forget. I'm also not playing it
Yeah.
safe, but these people are people, and I would rather they have as much information as they can. So the copyist is, going back to the roles, the copyist is also checking for that kind of stuff. Are we missing a dynamic? I think some of my students are often even surprised that they'll say, "Wow, the copyist like checks the chords and stuff." And I don't think that the copyist necessarily looks at the score and goes top to bottom per se, but as they're going through parts, you do notice that stuff, and especially the longer you've done copying, the better you get at it. You start to pick up on things. Like I have to some of my other orchestration colleagues, I have emailed them and said, this English horn note is out of range. And sometimes that happens, and I'm not dissing their abilities. I'm just saying that again, in our timeline, Sometimes things just get we work so fast, a copy and paste error. Or I've even seen where you got to remember Sibelius is a program, and we have hundreds of key commands that I've seen what an orchestrator friend of mine, really close friend, exported a score PDF. Then, oh, hang on, I'm gonna change something in the Sibelius file really quick, and saved it. But of course, bumped a key, and all of Trumpet 2 was copy and pasted from a previous score. It made no sense, but the PDF of the score didn't reflect that. So, again, the copyist is checking on that. That seems like an obvious mistake, and I hope a copyist would catch that. But, even little minute things have happened like that where it just, again, we have so much power in this that bumping it, can cause huge problems. So a copyist is not only looking at the musicality of it, but also the technical thing, like, are these hairpins colliding? They're making the parts look, legible.
Yeah.
Also keep in mind that for copying in Hollywood, or film scoring in general, we do tend to have larger, staves. We tend to have things look, I was joking with my wife because she's a violin teacher, like, I always think it looks like Suzuki Book One, because like the staves are like, massive, but they have to be, because remember, we record in low light. Our players are, sort of further back from the stand, and they're sight reading. That's, mic position related and stuff like that. And I always feel like, um I I use my cello skills, so to speak, as like, can I see this? And you and I have done a lot of, as we've established our part templates and stuff, gone back and forth, like, how big should it be? How small should it be? And it does depend, but keep in mind that the bigger the instrument, sort of the further away you are from the stand. So our music kind of looks like beginner music in terms of how big it is. So we want more space because the players write a lot in their parts. So we in general, I used to play like a lot of the Haydn symphonies when I, in college and stuff like that. And I always remember, like, you could fit a whole first movement of a symphony like on a
Yeah.
page, because the class in the classical music world, they just don't care in terms of how they format it, because they're often using old templates or using old sort of engraved versions of this. And unless it's been updated, and thankfully there are people out there who are updating these things, I'm actually glad of that. And I wish I would have played some of that stuff, because I'm not trying to diss Kalmus or Dover or anything. I understand what they do, but those older parts are really hard to read off of. But the alternative to that is that, you do rehearse these things. I think of my violin teacher growing up, like Roger Frisch. Like, he probably played Beethoven symphony like 100 times a year. I don't know for how many years he was in the orchestra. Like, he probably didn't have to look at the part after so many times. So in the concert world, it's different because they have a rehearsal. They can get used to the page turns, or the fact that one system might have 30 bars on it of a held note E. We would never do that in film scoring, by the way. We would
Right.
never do that. We would want to make sure we do like 8 or 4 bar phrases, just because it's easier on the eyes to follow that. But we're sight reading.
And they know the composer, they know the music they're playing, they know that stylistically, forget about just the piece, they know stylistically what the values are of that composer and how to attack a certain note, and that this, marking for this composer means to attack it this way, and oh, this is Ravel, so we sort of hover over the note in a certain way. And it's for some, people, yeah, it's sight reading. They don't know what the music is. They know, okay, I'm playing on a video game right now. And I think from everything you're saying, it's like, as orchestrators, we love music prep, we love copyists, we love proofreaders. It can sometimes be a thankless job, but it's our last line of defense before it gets to the music stand,
Yeah,
to save the day. And
it really
yeah, I
is.
guess we're talking about this because a lot of people don't even know that this exists, like music prep. Like, they think that once someone orchestrates it, that like the music just gets on the stand somehow, like it just happens by osmosis. And that's why we're trying to make this video and explain that there's a lot of people involved in this sort of conveyor belt and quality control of checking all of these things and rechecking.
Yeah.
And then do you want to move on to Librarian, or do you want to keep talking about,
No, it's
well, I guess we need to talk about what, printing and taping and
So the
Uh,
copyist, so after your copyist has made parts, it does go to another proofer, by the way, and it has its final. You can see where there's a lot of proofing in this, and it still amazes me when I get to the scoring stage. I will still see stuff, and I'll say, "This isn't going to break a session," but I'll feel kind of like, "Ah, how did someone miss that?" You know, and
yeah.
again, it's not a big thing. It might be like a bar number collided with a hairpin. Okay, well the clarinet player is not going to complain. They can still read it. It's not the end of the world, but that does happen. But
Yep.
we go through another round of proofing where someone is proofing the parts. They're proofing transpositions. I can't say that enough. Especially, I know we rely on Sibelius as a program, and we think it's the greatest thing ever or finale or whatever. Um, but you have to check your transpositions. You always do. Just it's not a big deal to just go through really quick and just this is where again you have to have a copyist who's really talented and knows like they can just check a transposition. I remember
I
just
have a funny story to tell you after this.
yeah, no, I mean it's just that you have to check your transposition. So after it goes through the proofreaders, it then goes to the actual like physical part of music prep. And in big films, this is where I laugh because these people never get credit and they do a lot. And I always feel that they sort of deserve like an applause here because this is always the 11th hour. It's really the 12th hour a lot of times where um, there's a session on Monday morning and it's Sunday night and it's 11 p.m. and there are 20 people. My wife and I actually own sort of a music prep company like this. And there are 20 people printing and taping parts and it's you got to remember that this is the very last thing and they are assembling all of the actual physical music for this film.
And that costs money, parts,
Uh,
paper costs money,
yeah,
taping, hourly rate of paying people.
you have
Yeah.
to pay someone to tape the parts. We print on paper that's thicker, so it costs a little bit more money. We don't print on white 24-pound paper, and we also print on larger, our parts are larger, just like they are in a symphony, and the scores are larger and they're thicker, so it costs more money. So you have to have the equipment that can do that. You have to have that equipment that is up and running, so you have to have all your supply costs for that, ink, toner, and the tape and all that, that costs money. People don't really think about it. They just think, oh, well, somehow it shows up on the stand, and they look at an orchestration budget and they think, well, that should just come out of it. It's like, well, no, it shouldn't because orchestration's its own thing, copying is its own thing, and then you have this third thing, which is sort of, um, you know, the physical part of it. And so in a big film, this is where you might have literally 20 people printing and taping music because it came in so late and the session is at 10 a.m. or 9 a.m. the next morning and we have 2 hours of music to do. So, and I will tell everyone too, COVID made this even worse because typically string players share stands. So it's two to a stand. So if you have 20 violinists, you only have 10 stands of music. Now with COVID, because of social distancing and things, all of our string players had to have one part to a stand. So one player to a stand. The amount of money has literally doubled for our supply costs, but also now the labor part for that, because someone still had to tape that. Instead of taping 10 30-page violin parts, you're now taping 20. And for our larger films, like we worked on quite a large, many larger films during COVID, it was unbelievable how much money this stuff costs. And so that's something to think about, as we move forward. Um, hopefully we get away from that soon with, but it costs money. Someone has to do that. And so what we call these people are often like sort of non-session librarians or non-playing I mean, they're sort of you could call them librarians because they are taping, printing, printing the music, taping it together, and they are collating it. And then again, someone is proofing that because you can't just print and say, okay, we're good to go. I mean, printers have a mind of their own. They might not print a part, or they might, I don't know, print something weird. I don't trust machines. So someone again is proofing all that stuff. And then it's physically taken to the scoring stage, and this is where you have another role, which is sort of the session librarian, which I think is the most stressful job ever, who puts all the music out. And Ed Tribeck and I joke a lot about this. He always says, he goes, Something will only go wrong when there's no librarian, and it's completely true. And I know Sammy in Nashville, him and I joke about this all the time too, where if you don't have a librarian, that's when something's going to go wrong. And often what happens in scoring sessions is that composers change their mind. They should be able to. They hear a solo and they say, I hear it on English horn and I don't really like that. Can we take the English horn part and give it to a clarinet? Okay, well, the English horn player can't just hand that part to the clarinet player. It's just not going to be. So the session librarian has to do that, has to now make a new part. And keep in mind, if everybody in the scoring stage is waiting for you, you're trying to move as fast as possible. We
Right.
had times where I can't remember if it was Maze Runner. I know Pete Anthony was there, and I know he was asking to change something in the cello part to give to the viola. And again, the session librarian had to now take that cello part, put it in the viola, reprint all the viola parts, and there were quite a number of violas, probably 10 or so. So that's 5 parts someone has to quick print and tape and run out. All the while, everybody's sort of sitting there waiting for you. So the session librarian is it's a job that somebody has to pay for because things do go wrong. The other thing that can happen is just, how do you problem solve when is a part missing? That happens sometimes. Or my favorite is when when a player loses a part. Keep in mind is this happens again, like we said, in a lot of animation cues where you might have 80 cues on a stand, and sometimes the players are searching and they can't find the part. So we often have, an extra set of parts with us just to run out and just to say, okay, here you go. And I always laugh because as soon as the librarian stands up and runs the part out, that's when they find it. So
Yeah.
I know this funny thing, but again, it's a role that somebody has to pay for. It has to be paid for because if you don't have that person, what do you do if something is missing? What do you do if you want to change something? A trumpet player can't just pick up a violin part. I
Well,
mean,
let's just talk about that. This is obvious for orchestrators, and for musicians, but for people that aren't musicians, different instruments read from different clefs and have different transpositions. So it's like maybe reading another language is a good analogy. So the reason that you can't hand a piccolo part to the, contra alto clarinet in E flat, aside from things being out of range, is different transpositions and different clefs and stuff. So they need to be printed in a way that they can read that language, so to speak. And I know that's obvious for some people, but just wanted to point that out.
like I said, composers make changes on the stage, and inherently, if the producer is there could be a lot of changes that happen. I've been on films where the composer has literally rewritten the cue or almost on the stage. Now, we may just record that the next day and at least give us some time to fix it. But there have been times where, great orchestrators like, and great orchestrators and conductors like Conrad Pope, I know Ed Tribeck's really good at this as well, is that they can actually stand up on the podium and give the commands to everybody and save the cop or the librarian a lot of time, and maybe they only have to make 2 or 3 parts instead of reprint all the violin parts, which is another role, by the way, as your conductor.
Well, I was also going to say, talking about making changes in the score, making, for some composers that they want a session score with all of the changes that happened
Mhm.
on the date. Oh, we changed this dynamic here. Oh, we taceted the trumpets and blah, blah, blah. How that's another
That
thing.
is.
Yeah.
Oftentimes, the librarian is keeping note of that if that's something that the composers want. Not all composers do. Some production companies, like I know Disney, they like to actually collect the music at the end to have it as a record of what happened, what was changed. Other companies will pay someone to make those changes in the score, and then we have what's called like a session score, and then we have a pre-session score, so to speak. So this is what got orchestrated, and this is what got changed. Because again, things change all the time.
Yeah, I wanted to point that out real quick, that I think things aren't written in stone, that when we're orchestrating that, Conrad Pope likes to say this, that it's a proposal, and things change, dynamics change, and it's not because the orchestrator didn't, follow instructions. It's just you hear something in the room differently, and maybe something's too thick or not thin enough, and you want to thicken things, you want to tacit half of the basses, you just want the cello to play by themselves, and there's just always things that happen, and so the orchestration is a first proposal of how you think things should go, but then things just change on the fly.
Yep. Yep. And
It's just
dynamic.
part of what it is. I think a lot of people don't realize that, because with concert music and you study a score and it's like, this is what it is, this is the final thing.
Yeah.
And even back then, and whatever, I keep bringing up Ravel, but in his days, like, yeah, he might have a rehearsal and change an articulation and do something, and
Yeah.
things change.
It's why Stravinsky had so many versions of, like Petrushka and right? Like he made changes. And again, I don't know if it's Bruce Broughton that said this, but I'm going to quote him because I remember him telling me this. He's like, you're never done, you just run out of time. And I think that's so true. Even for orchestrators, copyists, composers, everybody, it's like, you're not really done, you just run out of time. At least in the film scoring world, could you have written a better cue? Maybe, but you ran out of time. Like, could you have proofed that one more time as the orchestrator? Yeah, but you ran out of time. So, again, we always put our best foot forward and do, what we can. But anyway, that leads to even, you got your conductor as well, a paid position. Sometimes it's the orchestrator that does it, not always. Sometimes it's the composer that does it. Sometimes it's someone brought in from the outside to conduct. And their job is to, lead the session, make changes if they need to, interpret for the composer as well. When the composer says, I'm not quite sure, it's sounding too, it's sounding too full here. What can we do? And the conductor can make a change. And if there's an orchestrator in the booth as well, they can.
And that's what I just wanted to mention, that, we of course like to be at the session or listen remotely because we orchestrated it. And sometimes composers are not confident speaking to the orchestra. And, sometimes we're there to just listen to them and help sort of dictate the changes that they want. And sometimes there's a problem and they don't know how to articulate it, and we know what it is, and we can say, oh yeah, this needs to be soupant, needs to be a little more icy and menacing, where they might not know that. They might say, this needs to be more dirty or gritty or something. And so sometimes words to a player mean something incredibly different to the composer. And, we hear stuff like, oh, it needs to be more like, I don't know, more legato, but they really mean like more detached or something, like sometimes words get misconstrued and whatever.
And again, because music is so subjective, that, our job, why it's good to have an orchestrator at, if you are an orchestrator, you should be at the session. If you're a composer, you should have your orchestrator at the session if they can be, because it's just another person there on your side. Everybody's rooting for you as the composer.
Yeah.
The copyist, the librarian, down to the last desk bass player. Everybody wants you to succeed. So, having as many people around you who can help never hurts. So yeah, I don't know, that's in terms of the music prep, that's sort of, that's sort of everybody. I know you could go through there's the contractors and there's the musicians and all that stuff too, but I think that's sort of a different.
Well, I thought we'd keep it more in the realm of, sorry, there was a delay, like our realm of when we get hired and someone wants the music orchestrated.
Right.
Not saying that we wouldn't, reach out to a contractor at times, but
yeah,
it's more the overall arc of how things happen. Just a funny side story. No names will be mentioned, but I have a friend that's like getting a doctorate now and talking about making parts. He's never made a part in his life. And I, said it would be a good idea to hire a copyist. And for whatever reason, he didn't take my advice. And somehow he printed out all of his parts in concert. And the orchestra was rehearsing it. And he told me after a few minutes, he's like, something just sounded really weird. I guess the players weren't very good. They weren't sight reading very well. And then he realized that everything was in concert. And so that's obviously humiliating and unprofessional. But Yeah, that's the worst thing that could happen. That actually even surprised me. Like, how did that even happen in Sibelius? But
It's not common. You'd really have to break it down. But you know, and the thing, my
yeah,
brother's an oboist. He's an English horn player. Played in the Boston Pop. I remember he played a part once. It was a holiday thing, ironically. Since we're coming up on Christmas, and the English horn part was in alto clef. And I remember he was like, um, how does this work? Luckily, it transposed in alto clef too. So I thought, well, at least if it wasn't transposed, you could have kind of, you could kind of figure it out so much. Um, and he was just baffled. He was just like, how does that even happen? And I thought somebody hit a wrong button in Finale or
and
Sibelius.
if you have kids or you have pets, I know my cat Mooney will. I'll sometimes maybe use the restroom, and I see him up on this, and I just that's why I always close a score before I leave a room or something, because you just never know if somebody walks across your
Oh yeah. Yep. No dot,
keyboard.
no notation software stays open. My daughter likes to read tips and
Yeah, yeah. But pro tip, yeah, if you're using the restroom and you have children or pets, or you're, going out to run an errand, save, close the score. Do
close it,
not keep it open.
keep it open. Good
I
idea.
mean, I've caught my cat in real time doing it. I'm like, no,
Yep.
and it only happened once for me to go, yeah.
You come back and I know that like I know that I have friends whose dogs or cats have literally changed settings on their computers before. Like
Yeah,
the resolution or something like that.
yeah. So maybe let's just end this video and for now. And then, for anyone watching, hopefully this was really helpful in just understanding the process and all of the things that go into, for at least for composers in the DAW, like from MIDI to the orchestra and the whole arc. And hopefully there's just an understanding and an appreciation and just a confidence of how many people are seeing this music and giving it their attention. And I guess comment below if you have any questions about anything, or if there's topics that you'd like Jordan and I to discuss. So thanks for tuning in, and catch you in the next one.
Thanks.